today is a Georgian political expert, the head of GOK's think tank, Viktor Kipiani. Good evening, Mr. Kipiani. Thanks for accepting the interview request. Protests are being held for a week in Georgia. In the Western press, it's often called the Georgian Euromaidan, and in the Russian press, an attempt at a color revolution. What is the current situation in the country, and what processes are we dealing with?
Good evening and good to be with you. It's not necessarily about naming the protest, which is a result of relatively recent decision by the ruling party Georgian Dream to suspend accession talks with European Union until 2028. This is the latest decision in the chain of various decisions which caused quite broad frictions in the Georgian society. This protest is really very unique and exceptional from the protests which we've seen in the past, because this time it's not just in Tbilisi, which is the capital of Georgia, but in various cities and towns of the country. So it's a nation-wide protest. The situation at this point is quite uncertain, I have to be very honest. It is quite clear that the government is in a very awkward situation, to put it mildly. It is clear that continuing without concessions by Georgian Dream would be unsustainable and beyond, well, let's put it this way, rational limits. Same time, the protests as they stand for today, they're not decisive as yet to compel the government to concede on a political agenda. So, as I'm saying, it's like the pendulum, which is swinging back and forth. But what is clear, to wrap up my response to your question, that a big uncertainty, as I've already said, and a desperate need for a political compromise and political solution, unless the country is not plunged into the abyss of civil unrest and turmoil.
And with President Zurabishvili visibly supporting the protests, how do you assess the political fractures within Georgia's leadership? And what implications could this have for governance stability, Mr. Kipiani?
As you probably know, for quite some time, there was a big disconnect between the president of Georgia and on one side and the government on the other side, which is really very sad, which is really very deplorable. That's not how the political system should work, especially in the country which has the EU candidacy status. Having the candidate status always provide for a political consensus, for a dialogue, for finding a common language on issues of national interest. But as I've said, unfortunately, that has not been the case for quite some time already. The gap between the president and the ruling party are wide enough, I have to admit. And at this point in time, as we speak, it's really very hard to imagine how that gap could be breached. We should also point out that inauguration of a new president is appointed on the 14th of December. And if elected, and more likely the candidate by Georgian Dream will be elected, since there is no other alternative in that respect. So he is supposed to give an oath on 29th of December. Which also means that that signals potentially, and not potentially, but quite realistically, that signals another milestone in possibly escalating the situation. Again, if no consensus or no decision or no solution is found before that, to the point of what the role of the President Zurabishvili is and has been for the last years. she became, practically speaking, she became the leader of the Georgian opposition. Of course, she is a super, sort of, she's not a party figure. She stands above the party lines, but her different initiatives, especially before the elections, which was about the so-called Georgian Charter, it was an attempt to consolidate the Georgian opposition around the EU agenda. That attempt has not been quite successful, and especially any type of of attempts to unite the Georgian opposition, especially in the aftermath of the elections, has a quite a different shape. And by saying a different shape, my definition that since the process unfortunately has shifted to the streets, of course we face a different reality. In that reality, it still took quite some time for Georgian opposition to consolidate. That consolidation process was quite painful, and that pain has been reflected in consolidating the Georgian society. So, interestingly enough, when we speak about the President Saakashvili or the Georgian opposition, another unique feature of this protest that this is led primarily by a broad swathe of Georgian society. So political parties or political figures are not at the forefront of the protest. And that perhaps that is adding an additional vigor, an additional strength to the protest, which also speaks how much compromised the Georgian political system and the party system has been. But that's a different issue. So, in a nutshell, I would focus on this type of response to your question.
Mr. Kipiani, you talked about the gap between the government and President Zurabishvili, also the opposition. However, do you consider the possibility of dialogue between the government and the opposition possible?
Again, when we look at the crisis in a statecraft manner, in a responsible manner, and in a rational manner, with all the adequacy possible, of course, that dialogue and that solution is unavoidable. Unless non-return point has not been reached, and that non-return point is not reached yet. Although I have to add necessarily that escalation is picking up. It is quite. It could become quite uncontrollable at some moment, and before that happens, of course, it's hopefully there is still a space for the dialogue and for that solution. It's really very important to remember that a zero-sum game is excluded, and all actors involved should have to focus on the positive sum game. There should be solution. There is no other alternative, as I'm saying, other than plunging the nation into civil disorder and civil unrest. So that should be the biggest incentive for all the actors involved to realize and to acknowledge that the dialogue and solution remains the only remedy, the only option or solution to the crisis. And another incentive, I have to repeat, is the wide public sentiments in the nation, in the society. Again, to remind to your esteemed listeners that this protest is primarily led by Georgian society. So Georgian people, they are the key actor. They are the key figure in this process. So if someone on the political side would commit any wrong or would commit any mistake in that process, that mistake and that error and that flaw would not be given an excuse by the nation and by the society. That's quite clear, and that should be well understood by everyone who represents the mainstream political forces in the country.
Mr. Kipiani, many protesters, however, cite fears of increased Russian influence in Georgia. How justified are these concerns in the current political context?
This is not just the concern. This is one of the major threats which we've been facing. The threat has increased since the war in Ukraine has started. Russia's disinformation warfare, the hybrid warfare, and interference into Georgian domestic matters has been very explicit. Different types of propaganda which we had before the elections, which we are hearing these days, practically speaking, sometimes are the copy paste of the Russian propaganda. So even different message boxes which Georgian Dream have been exploiting before the elections, they've been very much almost the same, which we very often hear by the Russian propaganda and by Russian media channels. It's about identity, it's about traditional values, so forth and so on, which is frankly nothing wrong with either of them. But the problem that when those message boxes are abused or misused in terms of revoking the Georgian pro-European path, and when those are used for malign political objectives, then a big question mark arises. What is the real intention, and what are the real objectives and the purposes behind those messages? And that, again, relates not just to hybrid war domestically, but the hybrid war non-domestically. And when we speak about the non-domestic implications, of course, it takes us primarily in the first place to the Russian propaganda, which became very robust, very strong, and very vocal in this country.
And as you mentioned, the decision of the country's government to remove the question of negotiations on Georgia's EU membership until 2028 from the agenda became a serious cause for the consolidation of opposition forces and the rise of public resentment. Surely such a reaction was predictable for the Georgian Dream as well. But however, why did the ruling power take such a risk, and what is the purpose of actually freezing this process?
It's really hard for me to give a precise response, and when trying to give a precise response, probably that would be also the speculative response, a bit of speculating about the issue. What's been the driving intention before that extremely controversial decision? And when I'm saying controversial decision, it's really I'm sort of I'm trying to use as much diplomatic language as possible. But but to add to your question and to my sort of clarification, Georgian Dream has very unique skills and very unique capacities shooting into its own foot, and that's happening on a continued basis for the last several years. And you remember I spoke about the fragmented Georgian opposition and the sort of very weak public traction. So, however, even in those circumstances, Georgian Dream does as if acting in the shoes of the Georgian opposition, creating that agenda by its own. And that is really indeed very unique. This, as I've said, this latest decision is not just the only decision which caused that sort of discontent in the Georgian society, but they've been various other decisions before. So that uniqueness, how genius Georgian Dream is in creating a tempest in a teapot, and sometimes sort of shaping a trouble out of nothing. That's really very amazing. That's really very incredible. And But the latest decision has been devoid of any adequacy, of any rationality. And when we say that that's been extremely devoid from of any the rationality, indeed, then the question is, what drives them? Because they know the public feelings. They know what would be an international reaction by our partners. So, what was the real cause and real rationale behind, if we could speak about any rationale at all? So, that is again the biggest question. Again, not to get into sort of theories of conspiracy, but of course it smells very, very badly, not just domestically but internationally.
And talking about the international reaction, the created situation is also quite a serious damage to the image of Georgia. If the United States and the European Union were limited to the reviews of programs or financial support, now a number of countries, including Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, Canada also, have announced about imposing sanctions on the leadership of Georgia. Let's say, has Georgia crossed the point of irreversibility in its relations with its Western partners? What do you think, Mr. Kipiani?
When we speak if Georgia has crossed, we still have to bear in mind two different realities. Reality number one is the policies which have been pursued by Georgian Dream, and another reality is the reality which relates to perceptions of most of Georgians. So those two realities, those two pictures are quite different from each other. So it always depends, which Georgia we're talking about. If we speak about Georgia of Georgian people, of course that provides for a different response. If it's for Georgian Dream, then yes, they've crossed that line of non-return. Looks like this today we can say for sure, because it's really extremely hard to imagine that the Western partners would restore the confidence with Georgian Dream and would restore the dialogue which Georgian Dream has been exercising with their partners before that crisis has happened. So I'm very much afraid. that non-return is primarily on the Georgian Dream side, and if there is any hope of returning back to the status quo which we had for many years with the Western partners, it's about the Georgian people. And again, in these conditions of of a limbo, when you have the government which is not which falls very short of exercising those public sentiments and public will, and the public outcry of the protest, again to emphasize that addressing the crisis as speedily, as timely, and as duly as possible, and those could be appointing new elections. There could not be any other recipe, there could not be any other remedy for effectively resolving the crisis. The new elections are the only way or the only exit or out of this crisis. And again, I'm crossing my fingers that the leaders of Georgian Dream would get to that understanding. But time is flying. Time is flying, and there was a passage of every single day. The escalation could lead us to some stalemate or deadlock in finding an effective resolution to the issue.
And it is expected that the situation created in Georgia in mid-December will become the subject of discussion in Brussels by the EU member states. What reaction or action do you foresee from them, Mr. Kipiani?
When it comes to the EU, the policies by EU quite different from the policies which another major actor, which the United States, could exercise. And the policies by the United States are much harsher and could still be much severe. As for the EU, we all know that European Union is a complex structure and different decisions are subject to unanimity, and not to take into details, the Georgian dream and this government has few allies there to effectively block the decisions which would be unacceptable for Georgian dream policies in the context of Georgian dream policies. So it remains to be seen what would be a decision. You already mentioned individual nation members which have enacted the sanction policies. But when it comes to the EU, it's important to remember that enacting sanctions against Georgia requires unanimity, and how much, given the differences in voices and given different positions of few other nations, especially to the east of the European Union, how that unanimity could be accomplished. That's, of course, remains the issue. On another side, however, what has been discussed, that suspending visa-free regime for Georgian nationals, it's my personal view and the view of the think tank which I represent. I think that would be a big mistake on the part of the EU this time, because suspending EU visa-free regime would equal punishing pro-European part of Georgian society, and sometimes providing with a strong propaganda ammunition the disinformation war which we've already discussed in the course of this conversation.
And the situation in Georgia is being watched with considerable concern in Armenia as well. Well aware of the importance of stability in the neighboring and friendly country for the entire region. What conditions would need to be met for peaceful resolution to the current political and social crisis in Georgia?
We already mentioned that the new elections remain the only plausible way or solution to the crisis. However, I really wish to address that nexus between, and I have to mention that nexus between Armenia and Georgia. I very much appreciate the concerns in different circles of Armenian society on the way Georgia, or the path which Georgia would be taking in the years to come. And this is really very delicate and very sensitive issue, because again, without beating around the bush, pro-European Georgia means a lot for the national security and sustainability of the Republic of Armenia, and that speaks to those special bonds and special partnership which two nations are exercising these days. So again, pro-European Armenia and strong Armenia is about added value to the Georgians, to Georgia's security and national sustainability, and same time, vice versa, pro-European Georgia and healthy Georgia, geopolitically and politically, is an extra stimulus for Armenia keeping the pro-European path. So this is as clear as it is, and it speaks not to the interests of Georgian and Armenian nations, but to the interests of stability and the order in the region. So this is an extra implication, an extra concern, an extra consideration in the context of the Georgian crisis, which is not just about the Georgian crisis, but about, much broader, much wider, and much bigger.
Thanks for the interview, Mr. Kipiani.
Thank you, my pleasure.
My guest today was a Georgian political expert, the head of GOK's think tank, Viktor Kipiani. Thanks for watching us.